Yeah. No, what was it?
After finishing the tense recording sessions of the White Album, the Beatles took a break from a relationship that seemed to be increasingly frayed. On the verge of breakup, Paul McCartney proposed the Get Back project as an alternative to solve the band's problems, without so much complexity in its recording and returning to its roots. The project proposed an album, a television special, with a concert that would give the Beatles a second chance. But the Beatles got their reality check when tensions and their artistic differences returned. Locked in a film studio with an improvised concert on the rooftop of their studios, the Beatles were wondering about their future in January of 1969.
All I can hear, I'm in mine, I'm in mine, I'm in mine.
Let It Be, the last Beatles album to be released, was recorded almost entirely in early 1969. After the White Album sessions, Paul McCartney realized that the Beatles were in danger of splitting up even further if they continued to work separately from each other, which had happened on the previous album, where there were times where each Beatle worked on their songs on the album individually. Since Brian Epstein's death, McCartney had struggled to keep the band motivated, and this new project sounded encouraging. Returning to their roots, the Beatles could experience a new rebirth, especially as the project was scheduled to end with a live performance by the band, the first since their retirement from touring in 1966. However, tempers began to fray quickly. The Beatles' sessions in a cold film studio did not help the atmosphere, which in itself was starting to get tense. And after some disputes, on January 10th, George Harrison left the band.
I think I'll be leaving the band now.
When?
Now. Get a place. Want the enemy and get a few people.
He promised to return under certain terms. They went to Savile Row to resume the project. The rehearsals in the film studios were over. The atmosphere in the band was markedly improved. To help achieve this, Harrison invited keyboardist Billy Preston to participate after meeting him outside the Apple building on the 22nd of January, adding also that there would be no massive concerts or in paradisical places. So, at Ringo's suggestion, they opted for the roof of the building, where the world witnessed what would be the last live performance of the Beatles on January 30th, 1969.
Don't let me down.
The recording and filming wrapped in the 31st of January. Days later, Glenn Johns put together a mix of the songs for the band to listen to, and in March 1969, Lennon and McCartney called Johns to Abbey Road to compile the Beatles' new album, Get Back. Johns booked time at the Olympic Studios between March 10th and May 28th to mix the album, and completed the final master tape with the band on May 28th. Only one after 909 was taken from the rooftop concert. The rest were studio recordings. The changes were significant, and the album was completely different from what the band envisioned. For that reason, the Beatles rejected John's first cut of Get Back, and the project was paused. While the Beatles were negotiating their new record contract, they got fully into the recording of Abbey Road. And when it finished and released, the band showed no interest in returning to the Let It Be sessions until 1970. It was still provisionally titled as the Get Back Sessions. By that time, John Lennon had already left the group, and in the final recording sessions were only Paul, George, and Ringo. These took place on January 3rd and 4th of 1970, a year after the initial recordings were made. Get Back and Don't Let Me Down were released on a single in April 1969, and Let It Be was the A-side of the band's March 1970 single. Producer Phil Spector was invited by Lennon and Harrison to take on the task of turning the Beatles' abandoned Let It Be recording sessions into a usable album. McCartney was dissatisfied with Spector's treatment of some songs, particularly The Long and Winding Road. McCartney had conceived of the song as a simple piano ballad, but Spector dubbed in orchestral and choral accompaniment. Lennon defended Spector's work in his Lennon Remembers interview for Rolling Stone, saying, "He was given the shittiest load of badly recorded shit, and with a lousy feeling to it, ever. And he made something out of it. He did a great job. When I heard it, I didn't puke." Paul's differences with John, George, and Ringo intensified over Spector's production. Also, over representation disputes with Klein. So McCartney decided to announce his departure from the band, and his solo debut before the release of Let It Be. Although they told him to wait, Paul refused. The end of the Beatles was confirmed, and Let It Be was the last piece of their history as a group. McCartney wrote this song about his travel adventures with his wife Linda. As the Beatles were breaking up, it took a new meaning as a gesture of affection to John Lennon, that for some moment, when he heard the song for the first time, he thought it was about him. The song was originally titled On Our Way Home. Ian MacDonald suggested that the lyrics sounded like McCartney was probably addressing Lennon in contractual troubles. An early performance of the song in a guitar-driven rock style can be seen in the Let It Be film, and later in the documentary series, Get Back. Unsatisfied with this style, which McCartney described as chunky, the band reworked the song around acoustic guitars. The Beatles performed a finished version of the song live at Apple Studios on the 31st of January, 1969. This performance was included in both the Let It Be film and album. Dig a Pony was taken from the Rooftop concert. It's Lennon in Bob Dylan mode, reciting semi-sensitive phrases over a soulful blues rock. It begins with a false start, with Ringo Starr yelling, "Hold it," because he was putting out a cigarette and had both of his drumsticks in his right hand. On the recording, the sound of someone blowing his nose right after Starr's interjection can be heard, which Mark Lewison attributes to Lennon. When Phil Spector prepared the album, now titled Let It Be, for release in March 1970, he selected the 30th of January live version, but shortened the track by cutting the opening and closing "All I Want Is" refrains. These edits were retained for the Let It Be naked mix of the Rooftop version, issued in 2003, which also omits the false start. Across the Universe is one of the Beatles' most beautiful songs, and its incursion into the album was last minute. Originally recorded in February of 1968 and released on a charity album for the World Wildlife Fund on December of 1969. The Beatles took the song up again during Get Back, Let It Be rehearsal sessions of January 1969. Footage of Lennon playing the song appeared in the Let It Be movie. Bootleg recordings of the sessions included numerous full group performances of the songs, usually with Lennon-McCartney harmonies on the chorus. To ensure the album tied it with the film, it was decided that the song must be included on what by January 1970 had become the Let It Be album. Although the song was extensively rehearsed on the Twickenham Studios soundstage, the only recordings were mono transcriptions for use in the film soundtrack. No multi-track recordings were made after the group's move to Apple Studios. Thus, in early January 1970, Glyn Johns remixed the February 1968 recording. The new mix omitted the teenage girl's vocals and the bird sound effects of the World Wildlife Fund version. As neither of the Glyn Johns Get Back albums were officially released until 2021, the most well-known version of the song came from Phil Spector, who in late March and early April of 1970 remixed the February 1968 recording yet again and added orchestral and choral overdubs. Spector also slowed the track to 3 minutes 47 seconds, close to its original duration. According to Lennon, Spector took the tape and did a damn good job with it. In his 1970 interview with Rolling Stone, Lennon referred to the song as perhaps the best, most poetic lyric he had ever wrote. "It's one of the best lyrics I've written. In fact, it could be the best. It's good poetry, or whatever you call it, without chewing it. See, the ones I like are the ones that stand as words without melody. They don't have to have any melody. Like a poem, you can read them." Written by George Harrison, it was the last new track the group recorded before their breakup in April of 1970. The song reflects Harrison's absorption into Hindu texts, such as the Bhagavad Gita, and their denouncement of ego in favor of universal consciousness. When Harrison presented I Me Mine at Twickenham, John Lennon showed little interest and instead waltzed with Yoko Ono while the other Beatles rehearsed the song. Footage of the couple dancing was included in the Let It Be documentary film. In January 1970, by which point Lennon had privately left the group, the three remaining members formally recorded the song at EMI Studios in London for the Let It Be album. When preparing the album for release, producer Phil Spector extended the track by repeating the chorus and second verse, in addition to adding orchestration and a female choir. Dig It is credited to Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, Starkey, and is one of the few songs credited to all the Beatles. Glyn Johns' May 1969 version of the album had a 4-minute excerpt, which was later reduced to the much shorter version in the final album. Several versions were recorded during the Get Back, Let It Be sessions. The 51-second version on the album is an extract taken from the 26th of January version, which was a 15-minute jam that evolved from a loose, like a Rolling Stone jam. McCartney said that he had the idea of Let It Be after he had a dream about his mother during this tense period, surrounding the sessions for the Beatles in 1968. Mary McCartney died of cancer in 1956, when he was 14. McCartney later said, "It was great to visit with her again. I felt very blessed to have that dream. So that got me writing Let It Be." He said about the dream that his mother had told him, "It will be all right. Just let it be." When asked if the phrase Mother Mary in the song referred to the Virgin Mary, McCartney has typically replied that listeners can interpret the song however they like. McCartney first began to play around with Let It Be in the recording studio in between takes of Piggies on the 19th of September 1968. Some months later, the song would be rehearsed at Twickenham Studios, and the master take was recorded on the 31st of January 1969. On the 30th of April 1969, Harrison overdubbed a new guitar solo on the best take from the 31st of January. He overdubbed another solo on the 4th of January 1970. The first overdub solo was used for the original singles release, and the second overdub solo was used for the original album release. Maggie May, or Maggie May, is a traditional Liverpool folk song about a prostitute who robbed a homeward bounder, a sailor coming home from a round trip. The song had been a staple of the repertoire of the Quarrymen, the skiffle group formed by Lennon that evolved into the Beatles in 1960. Lennon was still making home recordings of the song shortly before his death in 1980. These instances demonstrate an important personal connection to the song for Lennon and may have contributed to the snippet being included on the album, Let It Be. At 39 seconds long, it's the second shortest song released on the official Beatles album. It was also the first cover song to appear on an album since Act Naturally was recorded in June 1965. I've Got a Feeling came out of the Rooftop concert. It's a combination of two unfinished songs, Paul McCartney's I've Got a Feeling and John Lennon's Everybody Had a Hard Year. Paul said about the song, "It had been a rough year or two for John. The breakup of his marriage, his estrangement from Julian, a problem with heroin, and there was the generally poor state of affairs in the band by this time. That's encapsulated in the combination of the phrases, everybody pulled their socks up, and everybody put their foot down. Those lines refer in some way to the state of the nation, or the state of the Beatles." That was something I wrote when I was about 17. I lived at 9 Newcastle Road. I was born on the 9th of October, the 9th month. "It's just a number that follows me around," Lennon explained. Later, McCartney said, "It's not a great song, but it's a great favorite of mine because it has great memories for me of John and I trying to write a bluesy freight train song." There were a lot of those songs at the time, like Midnight Special, Freight Train, Rock Island Line. The album version is a live performance from the Rooftop concert. This performance is also included in the Let It Be film. The song was written no later than spring 1960 and perhaps as early as 1957, and is one of the first Lennon-McCartney compositions. He wrote the song at his farm in 1968, inspired by the growing tension among the Beatles. Based on other comments McCartney has made, author Howard Sounds writes, "The lyrics can be seen as McCartney expressing his anguish at the direction of his personal life, as well as a nostalgic look back at the Beatles' history." McCartney recalled, "I just sat down at my piano in Scotland, started playing, and came up with that song, imagining it was going to be done by someone like Ray Charles. I've always found inspiration in the calm beauty of Scotland, and again it proved the place where I found inspiration." Spector made various changes to the songs. His most dramatic embellishments occurred on the 1st of April, 1970, the last ever Beatles recording session, when he added orchestral overdubs to The Long and Winding Road, Across the Universe, and I Me Mine at EMI Studios. According to author Peter Doggett, McCartney had felt the need to accommodate his bandmates when accepting Spector's version of Let It Be. However, following his announcement of the Beatles' breakup and a press release accompanying the release of his debut solo album, McCartney, on the 9th of April, he became dissatisfied with Spector's additions, particularly on The Long and Winding Road. On the 14th of April, with manufacturing underway for Let It Be, he sent a terse letter to Klein, demanding that the harp be removed from the song and that the other added instrumentation and voices be reduced. McCartney concluded the letter with the words, "Don't ever do it again." According to Klein, the following day, a message was relayed to me, from McCartney, that the letter spoke for itself. With Let It Be scheduled for release in advance of the film, Klein allowed the production process to continue, with Spector's version of The Long and Winding Road intact. This song was written by George Harrison as a love song to his wife, Pattie Boyd. In his autobiography, George describes the composition as a simple 12-bar song followed all the normal principles except it's happy-go-lucky. The song was partly influenced by Harrison's recent stay in Woodstock in upstate New York, where he had collaborated with Bob Dylan and jammed with the band. Music critic John Harris remarks of the surprising decision to include For You Blue in light of the more substantial compositions that Harrison had presented. Like Harris, author Elliot Huntley considers that Harrison deliberately refrained from pushing for his inclusion on his best material, believing that his bandmates would not do justice to songs such as All Things Must Pass, Let It Down, and the similarly overlooked Isn't It a Pity and Something. When McCartney introduced the song to the group during the Twickenham rehearsals, the lyrics were mostly incomplete except for the Get Back chorus. McCartney improvised with various temporary lyrics, leading to what has become known in the Beatles folklore as the No Pakistanis version. This version parodied the anti-immigrant views of Enoch Powell, a member of Parliament whose racially charged speeches, particularly Rivers of Blood speech, had recently gained much media attention. On the 23rd of January, the group, now in Apple Studios, tried to record the song properly. Bootleg recordings preserve a conversation between McCartney and Harrison between takes discussing the song, and McCartney explaining the original protest song concept. The recording captures the group deciding to drop the third verse, essentially because McCartney does not feel the verse is of high enough quality, although he likes the scansion of the word Pakistani. Here, the song solidifies in its 2-verse, 3-solo format. It's unusual in the Beatles' canon in that almost every moment of the song's evolution has been documented, from its beginning as an offhand riff to its final mixing in several versions. The lineup for the released version of Get Back was Paul McCartney, lead vocals and bass, John Lennon, lead guitar and backing vocal, George Harrison, rhythm guitar, Ringo Starr on drums, and Billy Preston, electric piano. Let It Be was finally released on May of 1970. It topped the album charts in the US and the UK. The release of the album was scheduled for July 1969, but was postponed until September to coincide with the release of the film, but had to be further delayed by the release of Abbey Road, which came out in that year. When it finally came out in 1970, it was known to be the last album of the Beatles, as the band was already split up. Let It Be topped album charts in both the US and UK, and the Let It Be single and The Long and Winding Road also reached number 1 in the US. Despite its commercial success, according to the Beatles' diary author Keith Badman, reviews were not good. NME critic Alan Smith wrote, "If the new Beatles soundtrack is to be their last, then it will stand as a cheapskate epitaph, a cardboard tombstone, a sad and tatty end to a musical fusion which wiped clean and drew again the face of pop." The taste was generally bittersweet. The reviews were generally harsh. The album was labeled by the press as the band's last will and testament, brilliant at times, sloppy and self-indulgent at others. The cover of Let It Be was relatively simple, but just as iconic and innovative as the band's previous covers. The black background and the 4 squares immediately became part of the pop culture. The 4 separate photographs shown on the cover are by Ethan Russell. The LP cover was designed by John Kosh. For the Get Back project, the Beatles' intention was to recreate the cover of Please Please Me, showing the world how they had changed since 1963. In May 1969, the band returned to EMI's headquarters in Manchester Square in London, where the same photographer, Angus McBean, shot them while imitating the original poses. The cover was prepared for the Get Back album. However, the photographs of the session were not used until they were published in 1973 in a compilation of hits known as the Red Album and the Blue Album. Dissatisfied with the outcome of the album, Paul McCartney released the 2003 album Let It Be Naked, a much rawer version of Let It Be, which, in McCartney's words, was how the album was originally conceived. Michael Lindsay Hogg, director of the film, had already worked with the Beatles on the Paperback Writer, Rain, and Hey Jude Evolution videos. The soundtrack of Let It Be won an Academy Award for Best Score. It was accepted by Quincy Jones because none of the Beatles attended the ceremony. Also, in the 1971 Grammy Awards, they won again in the same category, and this time, Paul and Linda accepted the awards. The original mix of Get Back included work by Glyn Johns, George Martin, Alan Parsons, and Jeff Emerick on some songs, the group's close circle. However, the final album was worked by Phil Spector. The first edition of the album contained a book produced by Neil Aspinall in some countries, and to this day is still highly sought after by collectors. Let It Be is a less luminous album than its predecessor, despite the irony of having been recorded earlier. The group's last testament is a short trip between the nostalgia of the past and the uncertainty of the future. The Beatles had ceased to exist. In the middle of their process, there was a war between George Martin and Phil Spector, another between McCartney and his three bandmates, and another between Klein and the Eastmans. And considering all the setbacks this work suffered, it is remarkable that despite no longer having the band's interest in it in 1970, Phil Spector ended up putting together a very decent album, a memorable closing album. The band had given all they had to give, and it was not in the priorities of any member to prove anything more as the members of the band. Everything was done. Their four separate paths were beginning. The Beatles no longer existed, and as the album closes, musically, they had passed the audition. Well, that's it for now. If you liked it, we invite you to subscribe and like our video. Thanks for watching. This is Music Box.